Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and what's next. It's a show that asks questions and peels back the layers of our average everyday experience and goes beyond scratching the surface. We interview people doing incredible things who are making a difference around the globe. Join me as we listen in and get one step closer to understanding that big ideas shared create collaboration. Collaboration can inspire community, and communities create social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. My next conversation, the next podcast today is with Mark Kingwell. We've interviewed Mark before, and he's one of my favorite people to talk to, without a doubt. He's a philosopher at University of Toronto. He's written voluminously many articles and many books. His newest book, Measure Yourself Against the Earth, which is probably one of my favorite titles I've heard of in a long time. He speaks on this about his reform, what does he call it? I think Wikipedia calls him a reformed Catholic, or not a reformed Catholic, a recovering Catholic. We talk about a lot of things. I think what I love about Mark's approach to life is he's a philosopher who is looking, peeling back the layers of our not so average everyday existence, and I think that's utterly wonderful. He likes to walk. I think he likes to fish. He's a guy who's got a lot of interests, and I think and a great sense of humor. You're going to enjoy this interview for sure. We talk about the new atheists. We talk about children being philosophers, and about philosophy being an infinite task. But this is a really relevant interview. Check it out. I hope you're going to enjoy it. And don't forget, davidpecklive.com. You can find out more about my podcast there, and rabble.ca. Mark Kingwell. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We have another returning guest with us here today. Professor Mark Kingwell from the University of Toronto is joining us to talk about, I think, a variety of things. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
So your new book is Measure Yourself Against the Earth. Can you tell me a little bit about the title, maybe where you got it from, and why it's important to you?
The book is a collection of essays, and finding a good title is always difficult. Especially, for a writer like myself, I guess, since I respond to a lot of different stimuli. Some of the essays are literary, some of them are more philosophical, some of them are political, some personal. So I was casting around for a title, and a cluster of the essays is about walking in the city in particular, and something I've really enjoyed thinking about and writing about over the years. And I went back to a book that I really love from a few years ago, Rebecca Solnit's book Wanderlust, which is a kind of cultural, theoretical account or investigation of walking. And beautiful book, beautifully written book. And she defines walking as how humans measure themselves against the earth. And what I love about that is not just the resonance of the phrase, but the idea that walking is the last form of transportation that we still use on a daily basis that isn't technological. There's no bicycle, and there's certainly no fossil fuel contraption driving us at greater speeds. You can only walk as fast as you walk, and it's really that sense of walking off the distances that you cover. Pacing out, measuring yourself in that sense. Through your neighborhood, along the streets of your city, or in the country, or wherever you are. So Mark, I mean, and forgive the low blow maybe. So why does anyone need to write 334 pages on walking? Well, why don't you just go out and do it? Yeah, I mean, that is true. I would say put the book down and go walking at some point.
Right, exactly.
And please buy the book first and read it, or read parts of it. But yeah,
it sounds wonderful, by the way, and I so love the title of your new book, which is available. It's coming out when?
It's out in October of this year.
October.
Yeah. So it's true that paeans to walking, of course, involve sitting, because you have to sit down to write them and sit down to read them.
Right.
And nobody abhors more than me the people who are looking at their phones when they are allegedly walking. So don't read while you're walking.
Okay.
But just to reflect on this kind of mundane experience is really, for me, very, very illuminating. I've written a lot about cities and about the built environment and architecture and how we occupy them. And I really think this idea of moving through the city is in some ways kind of under theorized, underappreciated, and it is.
Well, in some ways, would you almost say under attack?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's part of the written account that I give. The pedestrian is the lowest form of urban life, and many people use, even including.
I think it's the cyclist, actually.
Well,
in my world.
that's a good debate.
Stay in your lane, there, buddy.
Yeah. There are all kinds of things that are going on here in the politics of sharing or not sharing the space.
Yeah.
But it is a kind of gift that you can simply bestow upon yourself, to go out there, and it doesn't cost anything. And for me, it's one of my major forms of exercise. Frankly, I walk miles every day to and from work and doing errands and just aimlessly moving around. And it's a boon. It's a real revelation.
When you're at a party, do you? And the reason I'm going to ask this is because as I read about you online, Wikipedia, reviews, I've even found. I think you sent me the review of your new book coming out. The word eclectic comes to mind for me. Maybe for sure philosopher. Do you introduce yourself as a philosopher? When people say, so what do you do? Are you an instructor? I mean, you've got why? I mean, you're writing about. You use the word casting to cast. Nice fishing metaphor. You've written about fishing. Politics, architecture, space, wonder. I haven't read all your stuff, but I know you're all over the place, and that's not pejorative at all. I think it's a compliment. So yeah, can you? Don't categorize yourself, Mark, but tell me about that, because I think it's great. I think it's cool, and I think it's interesting, and I think we need more of it.
Well, thanks. I mean, there are some people who wonder,
Well, what are you going to be when you grow up, Mark? Right?
And I like to say, people who don't know everything that I do sometimes think, well, what is it all? How does it gather together? Mm-hmm. And but actually, if I look at my own output and the way I think, it is centered on, let's say, broadly political questions.
Right.
I'm a political theorist by training. I guess sometimes I introduce myself that way. The stuff about the city and about architecture and urban environment, that is all inherently political as far as I'm concerned. It's true that I probably have more literary interests than some of my colleagues in the philosophy department. But I think that's part of a sort of critical consciousness and exercising it as it finds appropriate targets.
And wouldn't you say it's part of the reason why you were drawn to philosophy in the first place? I mean, doesn't it give you a toolbox to look at the world around you while you walk?
Without question.
Yeah,
that is absolutely true. And it's the toolbox metaphor is importantly varied, because on the one hand, or in one voice, I can write journal articles for philosophy quarterlies, which are very, very technical. And most people who know anything that I've written probably don't read those. I mean, very few people read those anyway. And that might be the only kind of writing that some of my colleagues do. And I do that, and people usually don't realize it because, it's off in one corner.
Right.
But the same tools can be applied with less specific discipline, but maybe more interest to other topics and other kinds of experiences. And it is indeed why I got into philosophy. I wanted to think critically and learn how to do it at the highest possible level I could achieve.
And it seems to me it's part of the reason why you're probably writing for the Globe, Harper's, and other magazines that actual human beings read.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the other part of this, which is that I do enjoy writing. I like to work at the craft of writing. It's not just about being perspicuous, which is always a goal in philosophy, but also to be felicitous, which is a different thing. And to think of metaphors and images that carry argumentative weight, but are actually pleasant, maybe, or interesting in themselves.
And I saw a film recently, and I I can't remember what film it was, and I'm sorry for that, but it was a funny line, and it was to some artist, and he was saying, look, any artist who tells you they don't care if their art is seen or read or whatever is lying. Doesn't every artist want their work to be seen?
Well, as far as I know, I don't understand what the point is otherwise.
Well, Yeah, I mean, I guess it's an exercise, I suppose, of a sort. It's therapy. It's expressing yourself. You're getting it on the page, right? It's that sort of writing a letter to a former lover that you never send, right? You get it out of your system. But yeah, I mean,
Some of that.
yeah, some of that.
I do want to say, I guess, that those very barely read journal articles of which I am the author sometimes, and my colleagues.
Yeah.
They're important in themselves. They're adding to
for sure
some
they
total
are.
of knowledge.
Of course.
Even if they never garner a wide readership.
That would be. Can we get that line? Can I add that line to your Wikipedia page? He also writes plenty, barely. How would we phrase that? Of barely read journal
barely
articles.
read journal articles.
Yeah. There's a joke in there somewhere, Mark. Yeah. No, for sure. You're adding to the literature. You're creating a dialogue at another level that will go on to impact other students and other professors.
Or so we hope. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, without a doubt. Hey, can I read you a quote from your own writing?
Sure.
A book called Practical Judgments that was published by University of Toronto Press a few years ago. One of my favorite essays, Husserl's Sense of Wonder, Husserl being a philosopher who, by all means, talk about if you like. But, quote, most children, in other words, do not become philosophers. Early wonderers at the fact of the world. They are trained to forget the questions that have no clear answers. The experience of wonder may continue to visit many, but pursuit of the question is left to a few. Close quote. That's fantastic. And I think it's going to lead us nicely into this question I want to ask you about being a recovering Catholic as well.
Yeah.
But you said it's why, the toolbox, you chose to study philosophy, wanderlust, you walk. I mean, somehow, is wonder the thread here? Is it what's integrating all of this? And why is it? I mean, I've got a 7 and a 10-year-old. When we walk outside and the moon's shining, I make a point of pointing it out. I mean, it's beyond just, I think, curiosity at that point. But I mean, anyway, there's a lot going on here, Mark, and I'd love to hear you lecture on this, frankly. But
well, and I do that. It's one of the oldest answers in the Western tradition, anyway, and you find versions of it in the Eastern tradition and other traditions, indigenous traditions. That philosophical reflection, broadly conceived, does begin basically in wonder. It's that look where something strikes you, the moon, the starry skies above, the look in the eyes of another person, the petals on a flower. It can be infinite in its causes, and the experience is, what the hell is that?
Yeah, what's going on here?
And I do think, to talk about children for a minute, I mean, children are basically philosophers in that sense because they are constantly asking why and looking with those wide eyes at things. And then, for the most part, the pressures of life make most of us, most of the time, attend to other business. And that's the way things are. That's how it goes.
Yep.
And yet, I think the childlike nub of that experience is still within all of us. And philosophers, to be honest, many philosophers lose it as much as anybody, because in the pursuit of certain kinds of technical precision, the originary account or the prompt can often be lost too.
Interesting.
But I do believe, and Husserl, of course, believed this, and Plato believed it, and many other philosophers believed it. It all goes back to wonder in the beginning and in the end. That's how we get started, and that's where we keep going. Husserl is famous for saying that philosophy is an infinite task. And I love that phrase.
It's beautiful.
It gives a sense that though there might be local progress on specific questions, the undertaking is never ending, and that's part of why we keep getting drawn back into it.
Is that what Plato? Do you think that's what Plato? Sorry, we're getting a little maybe on our own way technical here, but we'll move on in a second. But is that kind of what Socrates meant when he said philosophy is a rehearsal for dying? It's this infinite task. It's daily. It's reflective. It's substantive. It's relational. It's all those things.
Yeah, especially in the sense that in this particular key of wonder, you're not allowing yourself to be distracted by the busyness of everyday life,
right?
Which for the most part is serving the purpose of keeping big questions at bay. It does lots of other things too. I mean, bills need to be paid, houses need to be built, children need to be fed. But for the most part, we're keeping ourselves from ourselves. We're not pausing to reflect on the difficult things like life and death. What's the point of being here? How do we find ourselves here? What are we up to? Can we know anything about why we should live this way or that way? About what happens after we die, if anything? These are tough questions. There's no surprise that we want to avoid them.
Yeah,
for the most part.
Well, isn't this? And what's interesting, as I did an interview recently with somebody about the whole modern existentialism movement. I mean, isn't this essentially what they were reacting to or speaking to? Was this empiricism and rationalism? Hey guys, hang on a minute. That's all important, but what about the soul? What about the human being? What about the other?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And again, to reference Husserl, who gets sometimes neglected in this, he was the one who in 1923 said there's a crisis in science, that it thinks it can answer all the questions of life, but it can only answer the questions as it sets those questions.
Right.
So answer comes with question and vice versa. And what's left out of this picture is something much more profound. So he was the one who influenced Heidegger. Heidegger was the one who influenced Sartre, and so on. And that's really the mini tradition that gives us the post-war existentialist literature that's really saying, hang on, we've got all of this technology and prosperity and the space race and automobiles and everything else, but what is it about life that we're missing when we focus on all those things?
So I don't think this is a major shift, but Nietzsche said God is dead, and I know that's something that a lot of people misquote often. But I believe on your Wikipedia page, and I think I've seen it elsewhere, you call yourself, or some people call you, a recovering Catholic. And I've heard phrases like that before, of course, from others in similar sort of conservative or fundamentalistic kind of traditions, including myself, frankly. What is? Is God dead?
Well, I should say first about the Nietzsche thing. Most people don't misquote it; they only partially quote it.
Right.
The very next phrase is, "And we have killed him."
Yes. Exactly.
So Nietzsche's interested in this, I think, particularly acute version of the problem of life, which is that it's not so much that he's declaring God dead. It's that he's finding, as he looks around, that the answers people give for finding life meaningful are bogus.
Right. Yeah.
And that we ourselves have drained the meaning out of life. And then there's a challenge. Then the challenge is, okay, so if that might be true, suppose, what are we going to do about it?
Right.
How are we going to reinvest our lives with meaning? And of course, he has his answer, which is a kind of almost atavistic, life-affirming embrace of everything, including suffering, which is tremendously brave and impressive, and maybe not for everybody. So it's to call Nietzsche an atheist is accurate, but it's not really to tell the story.
Right.
And I think that's true of a lot of what I consider interesting atheism. If we there's been a tremendous amount of attention recently on what you might call aggressive or evangelical atheism.
Right. Yes.
And I'm thinking of people like Christopher Hitchens,
yes,
who I consider a friend and a valued colleague. Some other people I don't know well, like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. And I find there's a quality of desperation sometimes.
Yes.
Why if this is so obvious, why do you have to keep hammering away at it?
Yeah.
And I know a lot of believers feel the same way too. And then it becomes a battle of fundamentalism, which I think is really unhelpful to thinking for oneself about these questions.
And it's so dualistic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so anti-relational on both sides.
Yeah.
If we are spiritual beings in one sense or another, and we could talk at great length about how to define that. How about relational beings?
Yeah.
I mean, being the new atheism or the old fundamentalism. It's just so black and white.
Yeah.
Come on, it's so yesterday.
Well, and frankly, to keep phrasing it as a debate seems to me dreadfully misguided.
Yeah,
so, even though it's entertaining, I saw Hitchens in one of his last public appearances debate Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister.
Oh, I so wish I'd been there.
Well, it was a thing because Hitchens was was bald from his chemotherapy, clearly.
Oh, right, yes.
Ill.
Yeah, tragic.
And yet he danced rings around poor old Tony Blair.
Is that right, eh?
Well, you would think as a veteran of the Westminster parliamentary system, he might have better debating skills, but frankly, no.
Wow.
It was a mismatch.
That was at Roy Thompson Hall, wasn't it?
That's right.
Yeah. That sold out very quickly.
Well,
if I
it was an incredible moment in a way for public discourse, because here it was a freezing night in Toronto.
Right.
People are lined up around the block to get in to hear these two British guys debate a theological, philosophical question.
Yeah.
It was the most unlikely public spectacle.
Yeah.
And yet, it was a thing. And but what it came down to was really Hitchens saying things like, "Organized religion has done bad things in history." I think that's beyond debate. That's just true.
Yep.
And then putting Blair on the defensive to try to salvage his belief, which is clearly personal and intense, from these charges of religious violence. And I think that just kind of ends up speaking past itself. It's just not helpful. And you mentioned the phrase "recovering Catholic," which, by the way, I borrowed. I can't remember who coined it, but there was a great series of books when I was growing up, which were written by a guy who basically shared the same sort of Catholic cultural upbringing that I did. And the books had titles like "Do Patent Leather Shoes Really Reflect Up?" Because the idea was that if you looked over at the girl next to you in catechism class, if she was wearing patent leather shoes and they were shiny enough, you could actually see her underwear. Yeah. I'm not making this up, by the way. That's
hilarious. I mean, what a funny title. Yeah. What is it? Do patent leather shoes
really reflect up?
Oh, it's hysterical.
Yeah. If memory serves, that's the title.
Yeah.
And it was just very funny because what you realized was, at least I did, reading these books, that what I thought was a very peculiar upbringing, which it was, but was more widely shared than I imagined.
Yeah,
it wasn't just me and my classmates.
What was so peculiar about it? I mean, I sometimes wonder when I see guys like, there is a clip with Hitchens and John Stewart that I've shown in classes that I've taught in my international development life, and because I talk about something that Michael Gilbert wrote about, multimodal argumentation theory, which is a ridiculous phrase, but it's about how the way we interact is really emotionally. It's not logically, or so we think. It's really on an emotional level. Anyway, and John Stewart and Chris Hitchens are in this debate, basically discussion, and you can so see how they're not really relating. They're talking over, above, beyond one another. And John Stewart tries to touch him at one point, and he pulls back, and there's this dislike between the two of them. And it's a really fascinating example of Gilbert's theory of this, the way we connect. But I see in a guy like Hitchens or Dawkins this anger, and I see what appears to be a reaction to something, I don't know, a miserable priest, maybe?
Yeah.
A school that they hated.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that their atheism isn't to be validated or that they've got good reasons for it. I'm sure they do. But I wonder, there's just this deep anger. I wonder what's going on there.
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? That point about touching someone during a dispute, that's really interesting because anytime you touch somebody, it's a signal of wanting to make a connection or hoping there is a connection, and the refusal of it says way more than even the offer does, which is.
Between you and I, I'm going to make a note right now. I'm going to see if I can find this clip and send it to you.
Okay, because that is a remarkable moment. I think
it's fascinating. It really is.
I mean, the part of this recovering Catholic thing. I mean, the reference is I hope it's obvious to people. It's to the language of Alcoholics Anonymous, where or Addiction Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, where you're never not what you are. So I'm never not a Catholic, and just like an alcoholic is never not an alcoholic. Right. Either you're an active alcoholic or you're a recovering alcoholic. Those are the only choices. And whether we accept that or not, I'm not sure. But with Catholicism, I think it's true. It's a cultural thing more than a theological thing, ultimately, at least for me. So my cultural Catholic is maybe another version of it, like you might be a cultural Jew or something like that, where it's not so much about holding specific beliefs, but about how you were conditioned and maybe maybe at an extreme indoctrinated. And I don't claim that in my case. I don't think I was ever visited with attempts at indoctrination. But I did go to a Jesuit school, and the famous Jesuit boast is that give us a child at a certain age, and he is ours forever.
Right.
I would say, on the contrary, the Jesuits taught me how to think and how to argue, and they're probably, I've been told this by people who might be expected to know, there are elements in my thinking still that are kind of Catholic. Concerns about salvation and virtue and other things that I sort of pursue in what I imagine are secular ways, but are maybe still tinged with this.
Well, aren't some of the stronger sort of schools and colleges, from a philosophical perspective, Catholic?
Oh yeah,
you got Duquesne and Boston and so on. I mean,
sure. Yeah, and I went to St. Michael's College after here at Toronto before going off to grad school, and it's there. That's really what it comes down to for me. Even though I have abandoned as the set of my beliefs as I go forward, belief in a supernatural personal creator, I think all of this stuff is still in there, as it is for anybody. And I would never speculate about other people's experience, but there are indoctrinating elements in organized religion, not just Catholicism, and there is abuse. I know Hitchens was particularly exercised about the constantly emerging scandal of child abuse by priests. And in fact, I on another occasion I saw him give a public talk, and he was so, I won't repeat the words, he was so salty-tongued about this that various people were driven from the auditorium.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, it is, Mark. It's something to get worked up about. I think. I mean, it really is, right? But sometimes I think it's presentation goes a long way as well.
Yeah.
But I wonder, is that enough of a reason not to believe?
Well, it is for me, and that goes back in a way to what you said earlier about being spiritual or relational. It seemed to me that as I worked through these questions in my earlier life, that lots of things that I valued were detachable from quite questionable tenets. So, for example, the nature of spiritual life, and even the kinds of things that might come under the rubric of prayer or reflection, needn't be theistic at all. And in fact, it seemed to me that the theistic versions were not as powerful as other kinds that I was encountering. At the same time, and I know this is something that happens to a lot of philosophy students, I spent a lot of time pondering arguments for the existence of God. And most people who are believers know that there really aren't very many good arguments, maybe no good arguments for the existence of God.
Right.
If you accept God's existence, it's not because you've been argued into it, or because it's bolstered by argument. I think it's much more like Pascal or a true fideist who just has faith because faith is faith. It's unanswerable. But I was young at the time, and it seemed to me that if I couldn't find a good argument for God's existence, then I would have to surrender that. Later on, I came to see that I didn't need arguments one way or the other. It just seemed to me that there was no viable reason for asserting the existence of a supernatural personal creator, and so I simply abandoned that without having to abandon a lot of the things that I still considered valuable. So that's my particular brand of atheism, I guess.
Do you ever come alongside someone who challenges that, who tries to take you on in a sort of Christopher Hitchens-like way, and say, "Oh, come on, Mark, you've got the roots, you've got the background, and over dinner and a bottle of wine"?
Oh, it happens.
Yeah, I'm sure it does.
It happens a lot. And in fact, I've been asked on many occasions to debate believers.
Okay.
And I always say no, because
I think you'd be a great. So, from what I know of you, I think you'd just be a great debater in the sense of a sense of generosity, where the Hitchens and the Dawkins of the world maybe don't have that.
Well, maybe I should say yes. Just
you should try it.
Yeah. Just in order to suggest that this is an argument that doesn't have to be so adversarial.
Yeah.
But I have said no, partly because I just feel like it's so set up to be dualistic in the way you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And I know some of my philosophy colleagues who step in when I say no, or try to get me to do it, they all say, well, come on, let's hammer the believers. I have no interest in hammering the believers.
Right.
I'm basically still trying to work out things for myself.
Right.
And that's where it is. I had a professor when I was in graduate school who was a former seminarian who had then gone into philosophy and lost his belief. And he called himself a reluctant unbeliever. And I felt this was an interesting other modality of this, that he really wanted it to be true, but he couldn't vouchsafe it in his own mind. And philosophy was sort of his next best option.
So can I go back to that? Sadly, we're probably going to have to wrap up shortly, Mark. But the question I asked you earlier about the reaction to the Hitchens-like reaction to something that happened in his youth or an interpretation, is it possible that the lens that he was given, this whole Jesuit kind of notion that if you get them young, kind of the Disney approach, right? Get them young and you got them forever. Is it possible that a seed was planted or seeds were planted there that are just so off, I don't know, I was going to say from a theistic perspective, wrong question, but from a relational perspective, is it possible that the representation of God or the creator, let's say a creator, was so perverse almost or distorted that your reluctant unbeliever professor couldn't get out of that framework? Does that make sense?
It's possible. It's funny, though, because when you push back on that a little bit, it's hard to find versions that aren't open to question.
Right, right.
I mean, of course, you get, in Christian belief, you get the loving God.
Right.
Which you don't get, say, in Judaism. God is not love in Judaism. God is God. And then when you open up the can of worms of theodicy, a friend of mine has a little boy to whom she was explaining the idea of God, and he sort of said, he asked some theological questions. He said, well, good people still die, and there are earthquakes, and all the things.
Yep.
And she said, yeah, that's true. And he said, oh God, he's not very good at it, is he?
Oh boy, wow.
Yeah. So, but that's sort of setting it up to fail, right? If you think that,
of course,
the so-called triangle of perfection, if God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, then theodicy will knock down at least one corner of that.
Oh,
because
absolutely.
There is inexplicable suffering in the world.
Well, and this is part of my argument against so many fundamentalists and so much of any religion. I'm not talking just about evangelicalism, but instead of saying to that question or to that boy, you know what, you're right, I don't have a good answer, they try to come back with, I think, in most cases, certainly the way I was raised, with a definitive, no, this is the way it is.
Right.
And I go, sorry, I'm just going to cry foul and walk away from that because it's not satisfactory. It doesn't meet me relationally.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And this is, to get back to the question of indoctrination, raising children and educating children, even educating young adults, which is what I do, it's a tricky business because you have to, it's just, it seems to me, a fundamental imperative that you have to give them room to work things out for themselves. Because it's just all too easy to create little replicants of your ideology.
Nice Blade Runner reference. I like it.
And that's just, it's not only is it not fair, I think there's something actually abusive about it.
Well, I think there is too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think, and again, I think this is part of why the world is such a screwed up place. It all comes down to bad parenting, Mark.
Well,
but the ability, I mean, and this is where I turn to the existentialists and I go, freedom, choice, responsibility for the love. If you don't bring up your children in that kind of an environment, at some point, as Simone de Beauvoir says, they're gonna realize, holy smokes, you lied to me.
Yeah.
And now I've got to react to it. So I'm going to run for my freedom. I don't want that, right? I'm scared out of my mind. Anyway, I somebody said, quoted the perfect love casts out fear, and then said, hang on a minute, the New Testament scripture. Hang on, let's turn that on its head. How about perfect fear casts out love? Isn't that good?
Yeah, I think that's well turned. Yeah,
it's a really nice phrase. Mark, I wish we had 90 minutes to chat. So can we do another interview down the road?
Absolutely, I would love it.
Yeah. So just going to read a quote from a review, quoting 24 shrewd, witty, insightful essays, cultural critic Kingwell, Philosophy, University of Toronto, returns to many of his favorite themes: fly fishing, the cityscape, art, and literature. Several consider the gifts of a city, particularly Toronto, where the author revels in walking, what he calls the greatest, quote, unpriced pleasure there is. From a review, a Kirkus review of Mark's new book, Measure Yourself Against the Earth. Mark, do you have a website?
I don't have a website, no.
Okay.
I'm
well, you better get with the 21st century. Come
well,
on, what are you, a philosopher?
We're 15 years in. I guess I can still try.
Yeah, the Greeks, can you imagine what the Greeks would have done with the internet?
It's a terrifying thought.
I know it is. Listen, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.